Brandy sold more than 40 million records. She was the first Black Cinderella on network television. She had a single that sat at #1 for 13 weeks straight, a Grammy, a hit sitcom that ran for 6 seasons, and by the time she was 25, the industry had a nickname for her. They called her the Vocal Bible. But in 2016, she walked into a courtroom and told a judge that she was not allowed to release a single new song of her own. Her exact words to Billboard magazine were these: "On paper, it looks like I'm a slave." By every measure the public could see, she had made it. And almost none of the music with her voice on it actually belonged to her. We traced the contracts, the court filings, and the master recordings to find out how a best-selling singer ends up locked out of her own catalog. The fame was real, and it was enormous. Brandy Norwood signed with Atlantic Records in 1993, at 14 years old. She dropped out of Hollywood High and finished school with a private tutor, while her debut album took over the radio. That self-titled album came out in 1994, went 4 times platinum, and sold around 6 million copies worldwide, on the strength of singles like I Wanna Be Down and Baby. She was 15. Her first real job in Hollywood had actually been acting, a small role on a short-lived 1993 sitcom called Thea, before the music swallowed everything else. 4 years later, she had the biggest song in the country, a duet with a singer named Monica called The Boy Is Mine, and it spent 13 weeks on top of the Billboard Hot 100, the longest run of any song that entire year. The album it came from, Never Say Never, sold around 16 million copies worldwide. She had already played the first Black Cinderella in a 1997 television production that Whitney Houston executive produced and co-starred in, watched by tens of millions of families. She had her own primetime sitcom, and other singers were studying her records, breaking down the way she stacked her harmonies, which is where that nickname came from. She kept going through the early 2000s with albums like Full Moon and Aphrodisiac, records that critics respected even as the sales cooled. And in 2005, she asked Atlantic for a release from her contract, and she got it. She walked away from the label that had made her a star, and she walked away without the one thing that would matter most later. She did not take the recordings with her because they were never hers to take. The money looked enormous too. During the years she starred on Moesha, it was reported that she was paid more than $90,000 per episode. Across the show's full run of 127 episodes, that alone would come to over $11 million. Her mother, Sonia Norwood, had left her job as a district manager at a tax company to run her daughter's career full-time. From the outside, this was a family that had won everything there was to win in the music business. So the question almost nobody asked at the time is the one that matters most now. Who actually owned the recordings? Brandy signed that first Atlantic deal as a minor. Under a standard major label contract from that era, the label pays for the studio time, the producers, and the marketing, and in exchange, the label owns the master recordings. The masters are the actual audio. They are the files that got pressed onto compact discs in the 90s and, decades later, get streamed billions of times. Here is what that means in plain terms. Every time The Boy Is Mine plays on a streaming service today, money is generated, and the largest share of it goes to whoever owns the recording. That is not Brandy. The artist earns a royalty, a percentage, often a small one, and only after the label has recouped everything it spent first. So the teenager whose voice sold 6 million copies of her debut and 16 million of her follow-up earned a cut of those sales. The company kept the recordings themselves, and because she signed at 14, the money that did come in ran through other people's hands before it ever reached hers. And here is the part that traps so many artists. Because that royalty only gets paid after the label recoups everything it spent first, An artist can sell millions of records and still, on the label's own books, come out owing money instead of collecting it. Big sales did not automatically turn into a big check. That, on its own, is not a scandal. It is close to how every major record deal in the 1990s was built. The scandal is what the industry did with that structure over the next 20 years. There is a modern version of this exact fight that most people already know. Taylor Swift went public with it in 2019. Swift had signed to a label called Big Machine at 15, and that contract handed the label the master recordings to her first 6 albums. When a music manager named Scooter Braun bought Big Machine that year, reportedly for around $330 million, he suddenly owned Swift's entire early catalog. Her answer was to re-record all of those albums from scratch, note for note, so that she could finally own a version of them, and it took her years. That story became front-page news for a reason. When you do not own your masters, you do not own the thing that keeps earning money forever. You collect a percentage of it, if and when the owner decides to pay you. Brandy was fighting that same battle 15 years before Taylor Swift made it a headline. She just never got the redemption arc, and almost nobody outside the music industry noticed. By 2006, the ownership problem was not even her most urgent one. On December 30th of that year, Brandy was driving on the 405 freeway in Los Angeles when her Land Rover struck a car ahead of her that had slowed in heavy traffic. The driver of that car, a 38-year-old mother named Awatef Abudihaj, died the following day. Now we have to be precise here, because this is where a lot of the internet gets the money side of the story completely wrong. The parents of the woman who died filed a wrongful death claim for $50 million. That number gets repeated everywhere, usually as if Brandy actually paid it. She did not. Under California law at the time, the parents faced a real legal obstacle because the right to sue over a spouse's wrongful death generally belonged to the surviving husband, not to the victim's parents. The California Highway Patrol recommended a misdemeanor charge, and in December 2007, the Los Angeles City Attorney declined to file it, citing insufficient evidence. The settlements that actually happened were nothing like the headline. The 2 children of the woman who died received $300,000 each. The victim's husband was reportedly offered $1.2 million, turned it down, and later settled for an amount that was never made public. So the $50 million figure everyone remembers was a claim, and it collapsed. It was never a check, she wrote. But the crash did cost her something real. It cost her years, and it cost her momentum, the one thing a recording career cannot afford to lose. In her memoir, she would later write that for a long time afterward, she did not feel she had the right to keep living her own life, let alone to keep singing, when the woman in the other car no longer could. Around that same stretch, her management relationship with Roc Nation came to an end. In 2008, she signed with Epic Records and released an album called Human. It opened with 73,000 copies in its first week, the lowest debut of her career, and the label let her go not long after. In roughly a decade, she had gone from the biggest song in America to being quietly dropped by a major label, and the company that still owned every one of her old master recordings simply moved on without her. For years, the car crash was the only Brandy story the tabloids cared to tell, and it drowned out the quieter one. The contracts and the ownership terms, the things that actually decided her financial future, never made a headline. They did their damage in the background, while the public was looking somewhere else. In 2011, Brandy signed the deal that would define the next 6 years of her life. It was a joint arrangement between RCA Records and a smaller company called Chameleon Entertainment, run by an executive named Brian Prescott. Her album 211 came out in 2012, and after that, According to her own later court filings, everything froze. She said the label would not let her record or release new music, while the exclusive terms of her contract meant she could not go make a record for anyone else either. Chameleon's side told the press a very different story, claiming 211 had only sold about 180,000 copies and that RCA had simply cut its losses. But in Brandy's account, filed under oath, the freeze was deliberate. She alleged the label was using the deadlock to pressure her into signing an even worse contract, one she said would have let Prescott profit twice off the same artist. Think about what 4 years of that does to a singer. She was in her mid-30s, in what should have been prime creative years, and she was legally forbidden from putting out music, while a younger generation of R&B artists filled the space she used to own. A recording artist who is not allowed to record and not allowed to leave has nothing to sell. She becomes a name sitting on a shelf, generating nothing, while the years tick by and the audience moves on. So in 2016, she went to court to force her way out. In March, Brandy filed against Chameleon in Los Angeles Superior Court, asking for $1 million in damages. That case got thrown out on a technicality, a clause buried in her contract that sent any dispute to New York instead. So in July, she refiled there, in a 24-page complaint that asked for at least $270,000, and, far more importantly, a judge's declaration that she was legally free of the contract. Her lawyers described her situation with 2 words: commercial bondage. The complaint even compared her case to the fight Keisha had been waging against her own producer, a comparison nobody in the industry could miss. Her attorney, Robert Maloney, told reporters the label was maintaining an unlawful stranglehold on her career, and he called it a type of involuntary servitude because no other label would come near her while that old contract still held her. And Brandy put it in the bluntest terms she had. She told Billboard, "I'm as free as a bird in my mind, but on paper, it looks like I'm a slave. The kind of deal I'm signed to should be criminal to any artist." There was one more detail in those filings that showed how hollow the whole thing had become. Brandy's side pointed out that Chameleon had actually been dissolved by the state of New York in June 2016 for failing to pay its taxes for years. The company that was keeping one of the best-selling singers of her generation from releasing a single song had not even kept its own corporate paperwork alive. The 2 sides settled the case in 2017. The terms were never made public, and we are not going to pretend to you that we know them. What we do know is that after that settlement, for the first time in a very long time, Brandy was free to make her own decisions about her own music. If these breakdowns are worth your time, the ones where we follow the money past the headline and into the actual paperwork, take a second to subscribe. We put out a new one every week, because the settlement ended the lawsuit, but it did not answer the biggest question sitting underneath all of it. After all those records and all those years, what did Brandy actually own? Here is that answer, and it is the whole point of this story. Across a career that sold in the range of 40 million records, she owned exactly none of the master recordings that carried her voice. The albums she made for Atlantic in the 1990s live inside the Warner Music catalog today. The ones she cut in the Epic and RCA years live inside Sony. Not one of those recordings belongs to her. There is no public record of Brandy ever buying her old masters back, the way Taylor Swift re-recorded hers to reclaim them. And this is the distinction the whole story turns on. That $11 million in television money from Moesha, if the reports were accurate, was a salary, and a salary gets spent. It pays for the house, the taxes, and the staff, and then it is gone. A master recording works the other way. It keeps paying out every year, for decades, to whoever holds it. Those recordings were the real, lasting asset, and she was locked out of every one of them. Her reported net worth today sits somewhere around $12 million, though that figure is only an estimate from a celebrity finance site, not a legal filing, so treat it as a rough number rather than a hard fact. Even taken at face value, it is a small slice of what a catalog that's sold at that scale generates over 3 decades for whoever holds the rights. Those recordings still earn money every single year, and that money goes to Warner and to Sony. The woman who sang on them collects a royalty when and if they decide to pay it. By the time that settlement set her free, the numbers told their own story. Between 2011 and 2012 and the next album she would fully control, 8 years passed without a new album that was hers. So in 2019, Brandy stopped waiting for a record label to decide her future, and she built her own. She founded a company called Brand New, and in 2020, she released an album called B7 through it. It sold around 25,000 copies in its first week, a fraction of her 1990s numbers, and it entered Billboard's independent albums chart at the top. It was also, at the age of 41, the very first music of her entire life that she completely owned. Every master recording on that album had her name on the ownership line, not a label's. 2 years later, she partnered with Motown for a holiday record, this time on her own terms. And that reclaimed control is exactly what her comeback has been built on. In the fall of 2025, Brandy went back on the road with Monica, the same singer she had shared that #1 song with almost 30 years earlier, on a co-headlining tour called The Boy Is Mine. Billboard's box office data showed the tour grossing around $9.4 million across just the first 9 shows it reported, from more than 78,000 tickets sold at an average price of about $120. In March 2026, she published a memoir called Phases, and it entered the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list at #1. That same week, she received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. In the book, she is direct about what those years took from her, and just as direct about the fact that she survived them. There is one detail in it that lands especially hard. She writes that when Clive Davis, the head of a rival label, renamed Monica's album after the very song the two of them shared, it felt like a man claiming ownership of the one thing the lyrics had been fighting over in the first place. Even the title, she realized, was something someone else had tried to own. She is also honest about the feud with Monica that the media built up for decades, writing that she had blamed the other singer before she knew the full story, and that the truth was neither of them held much real power in those early years. 2 teenagers had a #1 song, and the adults around them controlled almost everything else. In her own summary of all of it, she says she went through a lot, but she is still here, and she wants to be an example of resilience. A #1 memoir and a star on the Walk of Fame, almost 30 years after her first hit, is a strange kind of vindication for a woman the industry had quietly written off. She spent her prime years locked out of the business, and she came back to top the very charts and bestseller lists the industry uses to decide who still matters. And Brandy is not an isolated case. She is one name in a long line of black women in R&B who sold enormous numbers of records across the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, and walked away owning very little of the music that made the people around them rich. The deal that trapped her, signed young and built so the label keeps the asset, has caught a whole generation of artists in her lane. That is the pattern sitting underneath the individual story. So here is where all of it lands. Brandy sold more than 40 million records, and for most of her career, she owned almost none of them. The masters that made her a star still belong to companies she stopped recording for years ago. The only recordings with her name on the ownership line are the ones she made after 2019, once she stopped asking a record label for permission to release her own voice. That is the real cost of the deal she signed at 14. Not the $50 million headline from a lawsuit that fell apart, but 25 years of singing on records that were never going to be hers. If you want to see how another artist lost the rights to music that sold in the tens of millions, the story of what happened to Toni Braxton is already up on the channel.